Hello and welcome to our Week 5 supplemental lecture on Clifford Geertz's Anti-Relativism. This is one of the two pieces that we have available this week that was actually written before the conflict that gets called the Science Wars, and I've included it to give a sense of the ways these issues had been percolating along for some decades outside of the main debate that we're taking a look at this week. Geertz is a very prominent anthropologist, and anthropology has been particularly in the firing lines due to suspicion that it promotes relativism. These are people who study other cultures, and as there has been a degree of backlash against the ideas of cultural variability and variability in how humans might think about or perceive or value certain things, anthropology is particularly on the targets of people making certain kinds of critiques. And Geertz is noticing what he feels is a rise in anti-relativist discourse, and he's curious why that's happening. And in this piece, a little bit like the hacking piece from this week as well, he's going to try to analyze what the discourse is about, why people are afraid of this at this particular moment in time, more than he's going to try to engage or participate directly in its claims. So he says that you can look at the current period as having a rising fear of relativism, and he says a scholar can hardly be better employed than in destroying a fear. So he's going to bring his scholarly background to bear, analyzing and trying to get rid of this fear. And he says the fear he wants to go after is cultural relativism. And he says, not the thing itself, as in he's not interested actually in analyzing cultural relativism itself, which I think is merely there, like Transylvania, but the dread of it, which I think is unfounded. So he uses quite evocative language all the way through this piece, and the Transylvania one is something that is an example of this. So you've got Transylvania, it's just a place, like cultural relativism is a possible thing that someone can possess, but pointing to the thing doesn't explain the immense dread around it. What does that dread come from? And he's also tacitly setting up through this analogy the idea that the fear of cultural relativism is no more founded than the fear of Transylvania, that this is based in a kind of fiction by insinuation, and he'll develop that as he goes through. He says it is unfounded because the moral and intellectual consequences that are commonly supposed to flow from relativism, subjectivism, nihilism, incoherence, Machiavellianism, ethical idiocy, aesthetic blindness, and so on, do not in fact do so, and the promised rewards of escaping its clutches, mostly having to do with pasteurized knowledge, are illusory. And again, the sort of vocabulary, the imagery he's using, pasteurized knowledge, you've boiled it down and gotten rid of the contamination within it, and you get a kind of a pure but perhaps homogenized substance as a result. He says his goal is not to defend relativism, but to criticize rising anti-relativist sentiment. He says, whatever cultural relativism may be or originally have been, and there is not one of its critics in 100 who's got that right. So he thinks the people criticizing it often don't even know what the thing would be in reality that they're criticizing. It serves these days largely as a specter to scare us away from certain ways of thinking and toward others. Okay, so it's got a function, and he wants to analyze that function, and that function is to frighten us from thinking certain ways and to frighten us toward thinking in other ways. And he says, and as the ways of thinking away from which we're being driven seem to be more cogent than those toward which we're being propelled, and to lie at the heart of the anthropological heritage, I would like to do something about this. And then very playfully he says, casting out demons is a praxis we should practice as well as study. And again, throughout this piece, he's going to play with the fears of the people that he's criticizing here. So the fear is that we're going to break down these barriers between our accepted forms of rationality, and we're going to adopt all these kinds of superstitions. And here he is, and he's engaging in an academic critique, which is something that seems to take place within a formal sphere of recognized rationality, and he's drawing this sort of analogy between it and casting out demons that the people that he's talking to would regard as a superstitious practice. Okay, so he's not going to ease up on this. The rhetoric of the piece is part of the argument of the piece all the way through. And then he steps back and he talks about how to frame the issue. And he says, it is possible to criticize anti-relativism as a discourse, to ask what it's doing and why and whether it's good or bad, without committing to relativism. And he returns to this several times, saying, that you've got to do this because there is a recurrent attempt by people engaging in the anti-relativist side of this debate to frame their opposition as radical relativists of some type or another. He says, critiques of relativism are written by opponents who frame relativism in absolutist terms and therefore characterizes it as nihilism. So critiques of relativism often assume that a relativist sort of shares the same belief structure as the critic and then just inverts it. Somewhere else in the essay, Geertz will describe this as assuming that if you don't believe in my God, you must therefore believe in my devil. Okay, so whatever the opposite pole would be in the non-relativist framework, the critics of relativism assume that opposite pole is what the relativists occupy. Okay, and Geertz says that that's inaccurate and also rejects it on a personal level for this piece. He says, to suggest that hard rock foundations for cognitive, aesthetic, or moral judgments may not in fact be available, or anyway, that those one is being offered are dubious, is to find oneself accused of disbelieving in the existence of the physical world, thinking Pushpin is as good as poetry, regarding Hitler as a fellow with unstandard tastes, or even as I myself have recently been, having no politics at all. Okay, so if someone steps forward and says, look, they don't believe in absolutist foundations for morality or for truth judgments, or maybe they do, or are open to the possibility there are absolute foundations, but the ones that people are putting forward seem problematic for various ways, you find yourself accused of sort of being a strange kind of solipsist, of being immoral, of holding all sorts of objectionable views, and Geertz is mocking that. Okay, you can tell in the phrasing of the section it's a sort of a mild teasing around the image of what a relativist is going to believe. He says the notion that someone who does not hold your views holds the reciprocal of them, or similar hasn't got any, has whatever its comforts to those who are afraid reality is going to go away unless we believe very hard in it, not conduce to much in the way of clarity in the anti-relativist discussion, but merely far too many people spending far too much time describing at length what it is they do not maintain, then seems in any way profitable. Okay, it's a big mouthful of a sentence there, but it's got lots of fun components in it. So he's saying that if someone is engaging in an anti-relativist diatribe, there's a tendency for them to assume that the people they're attacking hold the direct opposite of their views, rather than trying to hold their views but in a qualified or nuanced way or some other alternative. And he characterizes the anti-relativists, and again, he has a tendency to rhetorically describe his opponents as people who have kind of childlike views all through this piece. And he says, it may comfort you to think that a relativist holds the opposite views. And that's because you're someone who is afraid that reality is going to go away unless you believe really, really, really hard in it. And he thinks that's silly, and the language here implies that he thinks that's silly. And then he talks about anthropology as a discipline and relativism. And anthropology, remember, is one of the primary disciplines that critical studies of science and technology are drawing on. And so it's not accidental that it would be an anthropological theorist or an anthropologist that would be intervening in this issue before it erupts into the science wars discussions we'll also be looking at this week. He says anthropology is not historically a relativist discipline. That's not where it starts from. But if you're going out and you're studying other cultures, you're quite quickly confronted with the question of what forms the basis of our beliefs. And he says that this confrontation is so strong that figures quite early who are just hearing kind of travel reports back from what's going on in the colonies start developing views that are, at least in the same space as relativism, long before you've got anthropology as a formal discipline, and certainly before you've got any kind of formal anthropological theory. And he refers specifically to the Montaigne piece that we took a look at in our handout in week 2. So if you've forgotten that, you can take a look back at that text. He says it's not been anthropological theory, such as it is, that it's made our field seem to be a massive argument against absolutism in thought, morals, and aesthetic judgments. It's been anthropological data. Because you don't need any fancy theory about it, it's just the confrontation with difference that's created this issue. And what he's essentially suggesting here is even if you did away with a discipline as a harmful discipline, unless you're going to do away with the actual difference that's in the world, you're going to have this issue. This is about a confrontation with otherness, with difference, and existing on a global plane where we're having interactions with people from different cultures is going to pose these issues. And then he brings up Montaigne. He says, after all, Montaigne could draw relativistic or relativistic-looking conclusions from the fact, as he heard it, that the Caribs didn't wear breeches. He didn't have to read patterns of culture. Okay, so you didn't need sort of nefarious anthropological theory books. Just the confrontation with the data is enough to make people wonder about absolute foundations for cultural values. He says confrontation with cultural difference is simply inherent in the field. What looks like a debate about the broader implications of anthropological research is really a debate about how to live with them. Okay, so it's not about the field and its nefarious assumptions. It's about what do we do now that we're in this global environment and we can't keep doxic anymore. We can't take for granted our assumptions that we've inherited from our own culture because we are confronted by the assumptions of other cultures. What do we do with this? How do we absorb it? How do we live with it? How do we come to understand our own values in light of it? And he says the people who are called relativists are worrying that the greatest harm is going to come from provincialism, from the overvaluation of our own society. And Geertz thinks that this is, in practice, the greater risk. This is what we are most likely to do. This is what history suggests is most likely to happen, is that we're going to overvalue our own culture, rather than that we're going to disregard it in some wild abandon. But he says anti-relativists want us to worry about, and worry about, and worry about, as though our very souls depended on it, a kind of spiritual entropy, a heat death of the mind, in which everything is as significant and thus as insignificant as everything else. Anything goes, to each his own, you pays your money and you takes your choice. And again, this mocking language that he always uses when he's talking about the anti-relativist position, the idea that there's something childlike in it, that you've got to believe in stuff really, really, really hard, and you don't have the flexibility to entertain competing possibilities. He's presenting the opposing side as rigid and as scared, and is engaging in magical thinking because they're scared. And the particular kind of magical thinking they engage in is the ruthless denial of magic, is the ruthless denial of otherness as though it is superstition, the relentless assertion of their own rationality. And to Geertz this seems a form of denial, a form of rigidity, and a rejection of available data. It's an inability to deal with the data we've got, where the data is global in nature. And then he talks about relativism as an imagined evil, as a sort of a spirit evil lurking in the background, threatening everything. And he talks about, he runs through a series of quotations, and the quotations are lovely. You can read them in detail. He quotes at great length. But he assembles quotes that blame relativism for all sorts of disasters in the modern era, for things that have gone wrong in practice, for undermining critical faculties. And the important thing here is that the quotes line up contradictory allegations. There are conflicting things that relativism is meant to have caused. And Geertz lists them at the end. Mindless tolerance, mindless intolerance, ideological promiscuity, ideological monomania, egalitarian hypocrisy, egalitarian simplisticism, all flow from the same infirmity. Like welfare, the media, the bourgeoisie, the ruling circles, cultural relativism causes everything bad. He clearly thinks there's some other more proximate causes, and that anything that's accused or held responsible for such contradictory things can't possibly be causing all of them. He says there's a fear that the emphasis on diversity might end up leaving us with little more to say than that elsewhere things are otherwise, and culture is as culture does. Okay, so this, again, sort of childlike characterization of the opposing position. And he says there are two primary responses then that are asserted as as safety measures, as defenses against relativism. One of them is the reassertion of context-independent notions of human nature, and the other is a reassertion of context-independent notions of human mind, and then he's going to unpack both of those. And the thing that disturbs him about the assertion of a context-independent notion of human nature is its association with sort of notions of deviance. And deviance isn't something that we look at a great deal in this particular course because it's addressed in a couple of other courses that you're likely to take. But it is a major category in social theory in particular. And it has a very ugly history to it. It has a history associated both with eugenics and with various forms of social regulation that have become heavily criticized. So Geertz has that in mind and is concerned about the reemergence and the rehabilitation of concepts of deviance that he thinks underlie attempts to reassert context-independent notions of human nature. And he says, reasserting human nature as a sort of universal, as something that transcends society, takes a wide variety of forms that can be broadly characterized as naturalist or rationalist. Whatever the form, he says, attempts to banish the specter of relativism, whether by sliding down the great chain of being or edging up it, the dog beneath the skin, a mind for all cultures, do not comprise a single enterprise, massive and coordinate, but a loose and immiscible crowd of them, each pressing its own cause in its own direction. The sin may be one, but the salvations are many. And this is going to be part of his complaint here. He thinks that while claiming that there's some sort of universal human nature may sound appealing, it may sound like it gives us a bedrock, something that's hard and reliable and secure, and we can then use that to prevent all kinds of social slippage of different sorts. He actually thinks the problem with the concept in practice is that it is immensely plastic, and once people have the notion that there's a universal human nature, they tend quite quickly to press whatever their own personal preferences or political preferences or cultural prejudices of the time end up going into that concept of human nature. Okay, so strangely, rather than providing a level of security and certainty, what it does is in fact provide an almost infinitely plastic mold into which people can pour their prejudices and then use those to judge other people and their behavior, and in judging other people and their behavior, historically quite ugly things have flowed out of notions of human nature and that other people are deviant from that nature. And he runs through a whole list of different kinds of notions of human nature here that I won't summarize. You can take a look at the piece. He goes quite quickly. But what's important is not the particular things. He says, look, he's not interested in whether there might be some productive research that comes out of these notions. There probably is. He's not quarreling with that. But he's concerned about the fact that each of them managed to arrive at this concept of a human norm, and that concept of a norm is then used to come up with a concept of deviance from the norm, and what deviates from the norm is what you can criticize. And he says the fear of relativism, raised at every turn like some mesmeric obsession, has led to a position in which cultural diversity across space and time amounts to a series of expressions, some salubrious, some not, of settled underlying reality, the essential nature of man, and anthropology amounts to an attempt to see through the haze of those expressions to the substance of that reality. A sweeping, schematic, and content-hungry concept, conformable to just about any shape that comes along. Okay, and those of you who read the McClintock may have a sense of some of the stuff that he's worrying about here. Concept-hungry concept. So you've got a notion of human nature, but that notion by itself has no substance. It has no specificity. People will put a specificity into it, but that specificity is itself actually quite plastic over time. And it's easy for us to look back at earlier notions of human nature and go, that was really bigoted, or that was quite sexist, or that has something obviously empirically wrong with it, but it's not that easy to do that in your own time. And he's concerned that once you take a human trait and you call it bedrock human nature, and you say that deviance from that trait is falling short of human nature or departing from human nature, you've given a veneer of science, of objectivity, of certainty to a concept that we have the historical basis to realize is often quite problematic. And then he talks about similar things involved in the assertion of the human mind, where here the opposing concept isn't deviance specifically, but irrationality and irrational beliefs. And again, he invokes this sort of image of Dracula, sort of the other conjuration, he calls it, the human mind, held up as a protective cross against the relativist Dracula. So again, he's going to present the danger of relativism as a fictional thing. It's like literature. We dread it and fear it, but in fact it's something we've made up. And he talks about this particular approach trying to develop a privileged language of real explanation. But just like the concepts of human nature, the language is in fact incredibly plastic. Different approaches prefer different ones, they conflict with each other, they change over time, and yet when someone is writing and talking about a particular language being the privileged language of rationality, it kind of elevates that language up as though it has more objectivity and more scientific backing than Geertz thinks that it has. He says they're all after something steadfast, reality reached, reason saved from drowning, a foundationalist view of mind. But the problem is that there are lots of different foundationalist views of mind, and there have been lots of different ones across time. And what we tend to do is to use these foundationalist beliefs to sort of beat up on other people who deviate from that concept. And historically, these concepts, as we've come up with them in the past, have not fared very well when we look back on them over time. He's asking us to use some of that historical insight and to reflect that we may be doing exactly the same thing now. And then he says, the resurrection of the human mind as the still point of the turning world diffuses the threat of cultural relativism by disarming the force of cultural diversity. The deconstruction of otherness is the price of truth. And this is something that will come up again as we go into future themes of the course. There's a real confrontation with otherness that is characteristic of modernity as a whole, and that hasn't gone away. We are a global society, but we have not fully settled how we're going to deal with the existence of other people, other beliefs, other views. And Geertz views some of these approaches that are trying to assert universals as ways of making this problem go away, of kind of vanishing it away, as though there's not something really there, and there's not a real difference there that has to be grappled with. He thinks it's avoiding the problem. And then he moves to his conclusion, and in the conclusion he reasserts quite strongly the status of anthropology as a science by talking about some of the aspects of science that don't seem that badly matched with some of the more kind of classical expressions of science we've been exploring. He says anthropology has been dedicated to keeping the world off balance. It has been the office of others to reassure, ours to unsettle. Okay, so the idea that it's something that is trying to contest established certainties is something that would seem quite compatible with some of the classical conceptions of science that we've looked at, and also people like Popper. Okay, with the idea that you try to tear things down, you try to refute them with the evidence you've got available. Geertz says, we have no doubt on occasion looked too far in this direction, and transformed idiosyncrasies into puzzles, puzzles into mysteries, and mysteries into humbug. Okay, so he's not saying that nobody in his discipline's ever done anything stupid. It happens. But such an affection for what doesn't fit and won't comport, reality out of place, has connected us to the leading theme of the cultural history of modern times. And again, if you think about the Kuhn, if you think about the Popper, there are very conventional understandings of science that say that what is at the heart of it is looking at what doesn't fit. Okay? How can we do something with this piece of inconvenient fact in Weber's terminology? And Geertz is presenting an image of anthropology as a science that continuously confronts with inconvenient facts that come from interaction with cultural diversity. For that history has indeed consisted of one field of thought after another having to discover how to live on without the certainties that launched it. Okay, this is a very common description of what modernity is about, is the constant undermining of certainties. We've been seeing people articulate this since at least our week 2 readings. Okay, that modernity has something corrosive at its core, which some people will be very scared of, and some people will view quite positively as an innovative and creative force. Brute fact, natural law, necessary truth, transcendent beauty, eminent authority, unique revelation, even the in-here self facing the out-there world, have all come under such heavy attack as to seem by now lost simplicities of a less strenuous past. Okay, so he's doing a list here of things that people used to believe that would have at one point been regarded as foundational bedrock that we now have trouble believing in the same way or giving the same security to. And he says, in spite of the fact that this has happened, in spite of the fact that we've become skeptical of these things, nevertheless, science, law, philosophy, art, political theory, religion, and the stubborn insistences of common sense have contrived, nonetheless, to continue. It has not proved necessary to revive the simplicities. Okay, so you can undermine your simple notions that certain things are grounded in nature, and yet, strangely, society goes on. The sort of nihilistic hordes are not at the door. All of the things that people are frightened of when they talk about relativism don't seem to have happened, but we've already undergone enormous upheavals. Okay, so again, this issue of what people seem to be afraid of when they talk about relativism versus what history suggests to us is actually going to happen. And he says the dynamism of science derives from its commitment to moving past what no longer works well. In this move away from old triumphs become complacencies, one-time breakthroughs transformed into roadblocks, anthropology has played in our day a vanguard role. Okay, so it's perfectly in the spirit of science. It is not an irrational thing to do. It is not something that is anti-modern. It is part of the spirit of what is modernity and what is science in its critical mode. And because of this, anthropology has made dramatic contributions. He says, we have been the first, meaning the discipline of anthropology, to insist on a number of things. That the world does not divide into the pious and the superstitious. That there are sculptures in jungles and paintings in deserts. That political order is possible without centralized power, and principled justice without codified rules. That the norms of reason were not fixed in Greece, the evolution of morality not consummated in England. Most important, we were the first to insist that we see the lives of others through lenses of our own grinding, and that they look back on ours through ones of their own. That this led some to think that the sky was falling, solipsism was upon us, and intellect, judgment, even sheer possibility of communication had all fled, is not surprising. The repositioning and horizons and the decentering of perspectives has had that effect before. And again, he's situating the discoveries of anthropology into a much longer narrative about modernity and how it works, and that modernity involves a constant overthrowing of what had been viewed as the bedrock, incontestable foundations of previous forms of knowledge. Anthropology is just participating in this process. It is not threatening it. It is not anti-modern in its character. This is how it is modern. And then he concludes, and it would be, I think, a large pity if now that the distances we have established and the elsewheres we have located are beginning to bite, to change our sense of sense and perception of perception, we should now turn back to old songs and older stories, in the hope that somehow only the superficial need alter, and that we shan't fall off the edge of the world. Okay, so he thinks that people are trying to go back from the insights that anthropology, among others, has generated, because they're terrifying, they're too scary, everything might shatter around us, so we're just going to pretend that never happened, and we're going to go back to an older set of beliefs that we used to be able to hold securely because we didn't have these inconvenient facts that called them into question. Okay, Geertz thinks this would be an enormous loss for this to happen, that we would be running away from insights that we've made available to ourselves. He says the objection to anti-relativism is not that it rejects an "it's all in how you look at it" approach to knowledge, or a "win in Rome" approach to morality, but that it imagines that they can be defeated by placing morality beyond culture and knowledge beyond both. Okay, so trying to run away, trying to undo what we've seen, trying to run back to something earlier to Geertz, is giving up on the challenge of how we're going to do this in the face of the inconvenient facts that we've got available to us now. Okay, it's not taking up a challenge, it's running away from it. And it's too scared we're not going to be able to work this out. And he says this, speaking of things which must needs be so, is no longer possible. Okay, he doesn't think you're going to be able to unsee what we've seen. If we wanted home truths, he says, we should have stayed at home. Okay, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. We've become global. We've gone out and we've interconnected ourselves throughout the world. We didn't stay home. Now we have to work out together how we're going to live with this.